I just want to introduce Luis Castañeda, our first speaker today, and a professor of the Syracuse University. This little book has every information on the bios on every speaker. And Luis, please come here.
Thank you, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Is this on? Yeah. Everything's good? Okay. Let me just get my presentation. So I am precisely going to talk about what we may start calling the Clara Porcet problem. We all collectively have a Clara Porcet problem. She doesn't have any problem because she's great. The problem is we don't acknowledge how great she is. Okay. So one of several events that took place in 1952 in Mexico City in the context of the 8th Pan American Congress of Architects, which was celebrated in what was then a brand new campus of University City, of Mexico City, was an exhibition titled Art in Everyday Life, a really major exhibition organized by precisely Porcet herself. And I was very happy to see that there's a catalog for the show, a beautiful catalog in the show across the street, and I encourage everyone to see that. And on the right-hand side, you see a photograph of the exhibition, which took place really in two places, at the University City and at the Palacio de Bellas Artes in downtown Mexico City. And we're seeing a set of Porcet's outdoor furniture, which employed a series of really interesting woods and fibers, among other materials, which is presented alongside Mexican folk arts on the left, as well as photographs of modernist buildings recently inaugurated in the Mexican capital city on the right. It's a very interesting kind of territorial statement that the photograph makes. As Ana Elena, of course, has pointed out very eloquently, the show was really emblematic of Porcet's position towards the design potential of folk arts, which was then a very unorthodox position to have in Mexico among designers. And the argument of the show really was that these types of artifacts, which were widely celebrated in post-revolutionary Mexico in general, but were still very much undervalued among modernist designers, could be fully integrated into a context of larger scale production, which was increasingly defined by these combinations of private funding and state commissions. The photograph, hence, for me, literally demarcates a certain terrain of operation within which Porcet wanted to inscribe modernist design as inspired by traditional artifacts and crafts and other kinds of things from Mexico, which the place was somewhere between the atavistic glorification of Mexico's folk cultures, which were very powerful at the time, and on the one hand, somewhere between or in relation to the expanded range of modernist forms of production that were then emerging in Mexican design culture, and which encompassed architecture as well as industrial design. And today what I want to argue is that Porcet's intervention had a lot more impact in this very gender-segregated world of architecture than is usually acknowledged. And I'm going to suggest that this gesture is one of the unacknowledged turning points in what, to me, may have been one of the most key transformations in Mexican design culture in the middle of the 20th century, which is the gradual rediscovery and reincorporation of a broad horizon of things dubbed folkloric, and I'll get to that term, that very tricky term, in a minute, into the realm of modernist design. To me, that's maybe one of the most important things that happened in all of 20th century Mexico's design culture. About a decade before this show that I'm talking about took place, of course, as we know, Porcet had already begun to kind of collect, select, remix a variety of regionally specific approaches to the design of furniture. Alongside her then partner Javier Guerrero, and they had attempted, primarily she had attempted, to assimilate these approaches to modernist production modes. Together, this duo had been one of two Mexico-based teams, as we know, to receive awards at the Organic Design Exhibition inaugurated at the Museum of Modern Art of New York in 1940. What we're seeing here is their contribution to this show, what they described as a set of peasant furniture. And the seating surfaces of this set featured an interlaced structure of istle, which is a very interesting fiber obtained mostly from the agave cactus, in addition to pine wood, which is an especially delicate and malleable type of wood. And of course, this kind of approach to things considered traditional or folkloric was not only, was shared among other kind of members of the same competition, very famously, very significantly by the team comprised of Michael Van Buren, Klaus Grabe, and Morley Webb, whose entry into the same competition we're looking at now. And this chair, the Akhirin Chair, which is a beautiful piece of furniture, is also on display on the show across the street. And this was a really significant kind of approach. It involved a number of different, very unique things. In particular, mecate tape as a primary element for seating alongside primavera wood, which is this low-density wood that is also especially workable for this curvilinear formal language of the chair. It's a lot about these materials that's very unique, very hard to convey in slides, of course, as we all know. So this entry, like Porcet and Guerrero's, also represented this presumed modernization of traditional ways of making furniture in Mexico. The decade between the two shows I'm mentioning, on the left-hand side, we're looking at the MOMA show, very significant MOMA show. On the right-hand side, we're looking at that show, Art in Everyday Life, with which I started, was defined by a number of different things or phenomena. Not only the increasing visibility of every designer I've mentioned within not just Mexico, but also the US design scene, very importantly, but also by the progressive incorporation of folk art into the panorama of modernist design at large in Mexico. And it's funny because as these two images show, what you start seeing in a number of different modernist environments, particularly the domestic environments, is the kind of gradual entry into the scene of different kinds of pieces of furniture, some of them dubbed neo-folkloric, some others not. And here we're seeing two mid-20th century expressions of Mexican modernist glamour in the domestic sphere. On the left, it's the Echeverria house in El Pedregal by Francisco Artigas, which has a butterfly chair. All of you, I'm sure, recognize it, by Jorge Rivas, alongside other kinds of modern furniture that you would have probably found in any hotbed of design from Palm Springs to Buenos Aires, circa 1955. On the right-hand side, something perhaps more interesting is happening because we're seeing Porcet's chairs, usually not attributed to Porcet. These are, I guess, the Miguelito chairs, which are based on a kind of hacienda type of chair from the state of Jalisco in Mexico, which are so central to that elaborate scenography of Barragan's much more formally traditionalist, but no less modernist space. And there's really quite a gap between these two different approaches to Mexican modernism, and both in their own ways are kind of regionalist approaches to modernism, which are contemporary and coexisted very interestingly. So Miguelitos obviously are a kind of butaca in a certain way. These types of chairs have origins that can be traced to the colonial period of Mexican history, and they take on a wide range of forms and materials depending on their regional specificity. But the introduction of these chairs, primarily by Porcet, who was herself expanding upon the rediscovery of these types of furniture by William Spratling earlier in the 20th century, but really modifying what Spratling did, eventually became very central to demonstrations of Mexican prosperity. For instance, that same set of outdoor furniture with which I started in Art in Everyday Life on the left, we're seeing the same picture again, eventually became the very celebrated furniture of a paradigmatic hotel in what was then the most prestigious tourist destination in Mexico. It's the Pierre Marquez Hotel in Acapulco on the right. And this same set of furniture also garnered Porcet's success at the 1957 Milan Triennial, where she received a silver medal for this particular contribution. And now on the left, we see, this is like an attribution nightmare, that picture on the left. Authorship, copyright, excuse my French, clusterfuck, because it's very difficult to see who did what in that space, but there's all kinds of things going on. It's the Camino Real Hotel, of course, by Ricardo Legorreta, inaugurated in 1968 for the Olympics, which were then celebrated in Mexico City, where you're seeing, among many other things, here in the balcony, a very comfortably seated, very posed photograph. Of course, this is an Armando Salas Portugal photograph of the promotional shot, where you're seeing a butaca there in the balcony. But the interior of the room contains already by this point a range of neo-folk pieces of furniture which were fully inscribed into the modernist scenography of the hotel. I love too many things about that photograph, how over the top it is to really get to it, but it's one of those examples where you can see how already it's so much in the air, it's been naturalized into modernist environments. I want to say, though, that although her contributions, Porcet's contributions, are really often circumscribed to the design of domestic or even, as I'm saying, tourist spaces, her reintroduction of the types of artifacts I'm describing was actually influential far beyond these realms. The 8th Pan-American Meeting of Architects, with which I began, of 1952, after all, was a formative event not only for Porcet herself, but also for a figure who subsequently loomed very large in the panorama of design in Mexico. And that is architect Pedro Ramiz Vasquez, who was one of many who illegitimately claim that they were the pioneers of industrial design in Mexico. That's really a position that Porcet has a much more rightful claim to than Ramirez Vasquez himself. And what we're seeing on the right is a little-known exhibition that Ramirez Vasquez put together for the same meeting of architects at the University City, which was these large photographs of significant Mexican buildings from different periods. And of course, what you're seeing there on the right is Diego Rivera's famous contributions to the Chapingo Chapel, which are shown inside of Juan O'Gorman's then brand new library at the University City. And the imprint of Porcet's approach, idea of what this design could do, is really very obvious in Ramirez Vasquez's subsequent work. For example, on the right, we're seeing the Mexico Pavilion for the 1962 Seattle World's Fair. For that show, curator Iker Larrauri, very significant himself, very underrated figure, who really did the interior of that pavilion. He adopted a very similar combination of large-scale prints of recent buildings, juxtaposed them with different kinds of design objects, many of them folk artifacts, in a very similar way that's almost copying what Porcet had done in the scenography of her own show. Larrauri included, on the right, you're seeing one photograph of that pavilion. This is another color photograph of the same pavilion, which included all these other kinds of artifacts, guitars, blown glass, shoes, etc., which was supposed to be evidence of the wide range of contemporary craft in Mexico. And that's, of course, a global, an international exhibition where these things were very prominent. And furthermore, for the same Seattle pavilion, artist Manuel Felgueres produced this very interesting mural in which he literally embedded a series of industrial and artisanal products. And he explicitly claimed that the mural represented a kind of synthesis of that all-important tradition of Mexico, of course, modernist tradition, the mural itself as a genre, plus or in conjunction with all these parallel folk and craft categories of object production. It's a very interesting artifact and also kind of not very well known. So fundamentally, this idea of material culture that exhibitions like this one attempted to encompass obviously moved, and this is where I get to the point of that tricky term, folklore, beyond notions of folklore as merely encompassing objects produced in pre-industrial contexts or which use traditional materials or solutions. And instead, this panorama of design, which is much more complicated, which is dubbed folkloric, perhaps is accommodated best by what historian Eric Zolov has defined as what he calls a folklorico-cosmopolitan paradigm, this very interesting, tense synthesis, which included design interventions aimed to be, of course, both universally palatable in the dialects of modernism for a globalizing audience at a time when Mexico was experiencing unprecedented cultural visibility. Think of all the things that are happening. There's these world fairs, there's the upcoming Olympics, et cetera, et cetera. It's a great cosmopolitan moment in Mexico. So that's one thing that they do. They're legible as modern, but they're also easily identifiable as a repertoire of Mexican cultural specificity, which precedes this historical moment. And this fluid horizon of design encompasses objects that recalled regionally specific materials or formal solutions, or that had perceived ties to remnants of pre-Hispanic culture, or that perhaps connected through their material actual facture, their craft of their making, to the living indigenous cultures of Mexico. All these things fall within this very broad paradigm of what folklore means. So these seemingly contradictory intentions, to be global, to be different at the same time, really are part of this very core dilemma of Mexico, not only Mexico, but also many Latin America's cultural avant-gardes, and we all know this very well, which is the dilemma is how to acquire this universalizing dimension at the same time as you retain a claim to difference. Difference within sameness, difference within universality. And this panorama that I'm calling the folklorico-cosmopolitan paradigm is very multimediatic, and is almost too much to love about it. It includes many things, including, for example, the many performances of the Folkloric National Ballet, Ballet Folclórico Nacional, a dance company founded in the mid-50s, which promoted its performances as a kind of recuperation of vanishing pre-industrial cultures of Mexico, retooled to suit contemporary taste. On the left, we're seeing the founder of the company, Amalia Hernandez, major cultural figure of the middle of the 20th century, who is training one of her dancers to imitate the posture of a figure in a classic Maya stone panel, which is behind her for a performance. And this moment of education on the left is happening at Ramirez Vasquez's National Museum of Anthropology, which is a modernist architectural space that is itself premised on the celebration of Mexico's indigenous and pre-Columbian cultures within the same folkloric cosmopolitan paradigm. This horizon of the folkloric cosmopolitan also encompasses the reinvention of performative traditions themselves, like what you're seeing on the right, the Voladores de Papantla, which is a group of acrobatic dancers who descend around these large poles we're seeing, and they create spectacular concentric motions with their bodies, and whose performances can be traced back to the pre-Hispanic history of the Mexican Gulf Coast. But they were really kind of rediscovered, very much reinvented, this dance troupe, in the mid-20th century, in the 1960s, in events like what you're seeing on the right, which is the New York World's Fair of 1964. It's very interesting how these things are, again, perceived to be timeless, but also they're absolutely modernist inventions of a timeless past. Of course, as a design object in its own right, the National Museum of Anthropology is perhaps the most precise articulation of the folklorico-cosmopolitan paradigm. Its production, we could talk a lot about its scenography, but its production itself, which I'm showing you now, monumentalized this fusion between modernism, a certain understanding of what folklore was, and craft, which is the same idea, really, to which Porcet was alluding a decade earlier with her show. And the process of production of the museum included the presence of large numbers of indigenous laborers. Labor is another kind of absent presence in this whole conversation about design. That has to do not only with gender, but also with class. The adoption of design approaches in this museum was very interesting. On the left, we're seeing how these tropical wood blocks were used for the paving of the galleries in the museum's second floor. It was all, the whole thing about this museum is that the whole thing is supposed to be quote-unquote handmade. It's very part of the mystique of the building. And on the right, we're seeing the use of Querétaro stone, these blocks of stone for the exterior patio on the right. And in many ways, this museum encompasses or kind of brings into fruition the kind of ethos for design for which Porcet was calling a decade before, which is a modernist reinvention of folklore inscribed within a large-scale state commission. And this is something that defines not only physically what this museum is like, but also the museum's scenography and curatorial paradigms. Ramiz Vasquez, Pedro Ramiz Vasquez, who was, of course, the chief architect of this museum, probably his most famous architectural work, he claimed throughout his career that he was the primary figure who fused together industrial design and Mexican folkloric culture. He now is dead after. I'm not going to say finally, but he's now dead, but he's almost like he's still from the grave making this claim through his various interlocutors. So in works like his Equipal chair, which is also on the show, beautiful chair, he did indeed, or his office indeed, translated a traditional type of chair, usually with animal skin seating of different kinds, and usually with a body of rosewood, which you're seeing there on the right in a kind of quote-unquote original version. And he translated that into that steel structure with a black leather seat, one version of which you can see on this show. And this chair has a very interesting trajectory because it became the official chair for Mexican diplomatic spaces in the 20th century. Because, of course, this architect is not just any architect. He was the architect with the closest ties to power in mid-20th century Mexico, a very dark, but also very interesting figure, sinister type of guy. So this chair really represents a decisive introduction to finish of this neo-folkloric design paradigm that I'm describing, and it's kind of an inscription of that into official culture. But it has many forgotten precedents that are really worth a closer look, among which is obviously Porcet's imprint. So I think what this show is going to hopefully help us to do, and what work might come after, is to rediscover her role and the roles of others like her as provocateurs, alongside the contributions of many other figures like that, who really kind of unleashed this potential, invented a new paradigm, and really changed the entire face of Mexican modernist design culture. And I hope the show compels us to continue this rediscovery, which is making a story that's already complicated, much more complicated in much more interesting ways. Thank you.
Please welcome our second speaker today, Patricio del Real from the Museum of Modern Art. And we are a little short of time, so no more presentations.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank for the invitation to present in the panel. It's a nice breather and respiro from the very hectic works that we're having, because since we are opening an exhibition in a month and 2 weeks. And also I want to congratulate all the curators and everybody involved with Moderno. It's a beautiful, beautiful stage show and an excellent show. It's a great contribution to the design of Latin America. When I was asked to address the theme about what makes Latin America modern design so different and appealing, I thought it best perhaps to present two moments when the Museum of Modern Art decided that it was important to engage the region. One was in 1933 in what today we could call the Diego Rivera project, because the museum's really engaged in multiple prongs, the work of Diego Rivera. The other was in 1970 with a proposed exhibition called 20th Century of Industrial Design. Now, I don't want to really go beyond just the juxtaposing of these two sort of moments in MOMA's engagements in Latin America, because I mean there's 40 years that separate these two, and perhaps because what brings these together is that these two moments have been completely forgotten. As it is well known, and as everybody should know, in March 1933, Diego Rivera came to New York, to the city, for the second time to perform frescoes at the Rockefeller Center. The first time it was to perform frescoes for the Museum of Modern Art. He was dismissed in May 1933, and 9 months later, the mural was destroyed. During this crisis, Nelson Rockefeller wrote to Rivera the following letter. While I was on the #1 building of Rockefeller Center yesterday, viewing the progress of your thrilling mural, I noticed that in the most recent portion of the painting, you had included a portrait of Lenin. The piece is beautifully painted, but it seems to me that this portrait appearing in the mural might very easily seriously offend a great many people. If it were in a private house, it would be one thing, but this mural is in a public building, and the situation is therefore quite different. I want to focus here on the appropriate side of politically engaged artistic practice that Nelson Rockefeller himself, so in his letter to Rivera, presented to us, the interior space of the private American home. The private home Rockefeller proposed could better house and manage the social and political transformation that the collapse of capitalism had enabled. I mean, after all, this was the Depression. From the private space of American domesticity, a new social project could emerge from the alliance between a modernist aesthetic vanguard and a socially responsible capitalist class. My point is that MoMA staged this socially progressive modernist interior in its first architecture room 2 months before Rivera's dismissal, and the socially progressive modernist interior had Rivera's works at its center. The room was staged by Philip Johnson in February 1933, and brought together, effective staging, it brought together functionalist furnishings with the color reproductions of the frescoes of Diego Rivera, effectively staging a synthetic modern functionalist, or should we say international style, interior. Now, very briefly, we cannot understand this synthesis between Mexican modern art and functionalism without highlighting the importance of muralism at this time, which was called the art of our time in the 1930s. And the epicenter of this art form was the Mexican school, and of course the work of Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Siqueiros, and Jose Clemente Orozco. In fact, so significant was muralism that Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnston had to acknowledge its presence and vitality in contemporary architecture, referring to it directly in the international style, something that is sometimes forgotten. Alfred Brad himself, in the now very famous torpedo diagram, clearly drew, if not the future of art as a whole, certainly that of the collection at MoMA, and it had Mexico at its vanguard. It is precisely at this moment when the Mexican art is considered the vanguard of art that it is linked to modern architecture at MoMA. The architecture room was a development of the exhibition Diego Rivera, for which Rivera, in 1931, for which Rivera produced frescoes, movable frescoes, that are here, were here represented in 2011 at MoMA. So the reproductions hung in the architecture room designed by Philip Johnson have to be understood in this kind of project of transforming the murals from Rivera to the movable frescoes to the reproductions to become household consumable objects. The Rivera color reproductions and artwork offered an overlap between traditional techniques and industrial technology. Oops, sorry, I'm missing a page here. Yeah, no, that was it. Okay, important to the story. The overall intent of the show, of staging the reproductions in the architecture room, was simply to sell a folio that you see here, which was composed of 15 black and white monotone prints and 19 prints of Diego Rivera's most famous murals in Mexico. The color plates were printed by the German publishing house Ganymede with a new color-type technique that captured the rich textures and dynamic brushstrokes of Rivera's mural. It was, and the press cited, as if one could own a Rivera mural itself, or at least a piece of a Rivera mural, as the vibrancy and vitality of the earth colors unfolded the craft-like production of the mural art form itself. At the same time, the reproductions were celebrated as a feat of technological reproduction, a technology with German pedigree that ensued a faithful facsimile up to the finest detail. Reverse colors and work offered an overlap between traditional techniques and industrial technology. The industrial image of the furnishings and objects enhanced and reinforced the message of reproducibility that was celebrated in the press and that the reproductions meant to celebrate also. I say industrial image because most of the pieces here, if we look or staged here by Johnson, including the furnishings, were produced with limited industrial techniques. In fact, one could argue that the only purely mechanical objects or machine objects in the architecture room were the textiles, the potteries, and the color reproductions themselves. The alliance between figurative social realism and modern functionalism may seem a bit odd, and it is still very, very big, strange, at least to me. Yet one must remember that the battle of modernism for a true modernist aesthetics was waged in interior spaces. And this is clear when one examines and goes back to the International Style book and sees a number of interiors that are completely staged in order to produce this kind of modern persona, this modern interior, this modern space to inhabit. The Forgotten Architecture Room by Philip Johnson with Rivera's works resonates clearly with the tensions between the rural and the urban that were clearly present in the Villa Mandrot here in the International Style book. The construction of an urbane and interior atmosphere was at the same time a high priority for Philip Johnson, who deployed his stage interiors in taste-making journals such as Vogue and Art and Decoration. Rivera's work, however, tested the limits of the International Style with his agrarian and peasant works, reflected and celebrated perhaps in Philip Johnson's curatorial move in the colors that he deploys, for example, in the brown linoleum walls, in the upholstery, also in brown. So these very few, but yet very measured and directed choices of Johnson deploys and staged in the architecture room offers us perhaps a link between agrarianism and functionalism through a color abstraction that perhaps at the same time effectively distance the modern functionalist furnishings of the modern atmosphere from the actual work of agrarian and rural, of the agrarian and the rural, which are clearly present, as we see here, in the prints by Rivera. Johnson, for example, I could argue, was very careful not to develop too strong links between the farm and the city, between the rural and the urban. He may have staged, for example, He must use the form the cowhide upholstery that Perriand and Le Corbusier had used in the chaise longue, but this would actually clearly accentuate perhaps too much the world of actual agrarian labor and agrarian and artisan labor. Sorry. If in 1933 MoMA staged this possible synthesis between the city and the countryside in a modern interior, by the 1970s, 40 years span, a new and decisive industrial project appeared for the Department of Architecture and Design. In 1970, the Department of Architecture and Design, headed by Arthur Drexler, thought to organize an exhibition that, I quote, to create awareness of industrial design as a major activity where man creates the artifice of his own culture and to remark upon its special relevance in an increasingly industrialized world. Tentatively titled 20th Century Industrial Design, the exhibition was meant to be sent to Mexico City, Caracas, Bogotá, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo from July to December 1972. After its run in Latin America, it would remain permanently in Buenos Aires as the core nucleus of the first permanent design collection in South America. The pieces were to be donated by MoMA with approximately 400 objects. This would have been literally the duplication of the collection of industrial design at MoMA that would have been deposited in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The project was spearheaded by Emilian Bas, the then 28-year-old curator of design at MoMA. Sponsored by MoMA's International Council, this initiative was intended as a fully reciprocal cultural exchange project. As part of the structure of exchange, 2 curatorial interns, one of them being Susana Torre, would train in the museum and ensure the needs and interests of Latin American audiences. In Buenos Aires, a private foundation, and these are possibilities for the collection to be sent, or actually objects for the collection that were to be sent. In Buenos Aires, a private foundation, la Fundación para la Investigación y Desarrollo del Diseño, was created in 1970 to oversee the creation of a design center that would house, manage, and show the collection donated by MoMA. This center would prepare contemporary exhibitions concerned with industrial design and management and administer the permanent collection, and it would also assemble a collection of design objects produced in the last 10 years in Latin America, which we could venture to say most of them are already presented here in New York, in Moderno. But just to present, there was no actual list. I haven't found any actual list, but possibilities would, of course, would have been, as we have seen, Porcet, DBKF Chair, Méndez da Rocha, or Janelo, Valiero, Linabo, and Fasonello, Linabo, and Juan Baixas, which you have actually just incorporated into the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, or Manteola, Petershevsky, Sanchez Gomez, Santos Solsona, and Vignoli. The foundation will also create a sponsored research and development institute, and it would underwrite a future school. The intent was to create the prime center of industrial design in South America by introducing design in the context of all managerial, marketing, and distribution processes, and thus stimulate national design products and patents. The overall purpose, as stated, was to break consumer dependency on foreign products and abate the stronghold that the importadores de muebles had on the national industry. Moreover, the Center and Research Institute sought to transform an industry held back by foreign patents that require the payment of royalties for foreign products produced in Argentina and limited their circulation to a national market, as these products could not be exported to other Latin American markets. The prospective aim then was both to consolidate the local market and create an export industry aimed first at Latin America. The Institute will live in the 3 floors of the Unión Industrial Argentina, the UAA building, designed in 1968 by the architecture firm Manteola, Petershevsky, Sanchez Gomez, Santos Solsona, Vignoli. It would to be opened in 1973. It actually opened in 1974. The project remained alive until 1975-76, being pushed by Walter Rasmussen, director of the international program, with attempts to send it first to Venezuela, then to Mexico at the new Museum of El Chopo, and to be installed by Eduardo Terrazas. The exhibition and collection would then travel to Sao Paulo, Brazil, where it will remain permanently in the Senai building, the building of Federações Industrias, since it actually never went to Argentina, forgot to mention. The last communication in 1976, which I've found, was on a checklist of almost 500 objects, which are now in storage, awaiting a decision on the tour. The tour never materialized. And I guess we can leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Luis and Patricio. I think it's a very interesting both papers, and which is great is that Clara Porcet is present always in this. I think that in both lectures we have this idea that Latin America needs a special model for design. It's a model that will inscribe Latin American design in a kind of a larger context. It's a model for the production of design, for the consumption of design, and for the exhibition of design. Clara Porcet was really aware of that, and I loosely translate some of lines from the introduction of the El arte en la vida diaria, art in daily life. She was really concerned of the output of the local industry, because to her view, the industrial production at that time, the output of the pieces were lacking the personality and the good taste that was kind of traditional on the Latin American production. And that was because the love of the artisans producing the objects was substituted by the stupidity of the machines. This is something like key. And she also insisted on the role of the designer that she called artist. And that was the only way in which mechanically produced design will reach the levels of excellency. It was because of the use of industrial design. So she suggested that the exhibition, the art in daily life, was just the beginning of a process. And it is very important, the title of the exhibition, the use of art in daily life, meaning the use of design in a daily life. Because for Porcet, design was art. And she insisted in creating this different category that on which design was not a kind of applied or minor art, so it was belonged to something larger that is art. She bitterly regretted on the introduction the lack of interest of Mexican producers and American manufacturers active in Mexico and to participate in the exhibition. She devotes like half a page on that, which is remarkable, and without mentioning names. But apparently she tried for a couple of years to engage most companies and the project, and she ended like engaging her fellow designers in that. Also, I found very remarkable and Patricio's lecture is the role of architects into design. I really was surprised with the second exhibition and this project. And I found extremely interesting that they were proposing Buenos Aires as the final destination for this big collection. In the early 1970s, Buenos Aires was the center of design in Latin America. Like no other country had strong industries. There were the two big conglomerates, the Kaiser companies, and especially the Di Tella Siam. And Di Tella had this major design in-house agency called Agens that was first directed by Frank Memmeldorf and then by Mendes Mosquera, so two key figures of design. So Argentinian design in the late 60s and early 1970s was the top of South America. And I found a kind of contradiction, this insistence of MOMA of bringing good design to Argentina when they were producing extraordinary design, and they had Instituto Di Tella, the kind of leading the production of graphic design in the region. And with these two kind of comments, I would like to invite Luis and Patricio to kind of talk on these issues.
What strikes me most about that show of Porcet, and not just that show, but in general, her gestures from that moment, is that she understands design in such a way, and this is there's modernist roots for this way of understanding design. The production is always very key to what she's saying, and every one of these gestures has to be interpreted as a kind of a primer for production, a provocation to not only her fellow designers, but also to the entire kind of world within which design is produced. And there's many different ways that you can kind of see that reflected in her work. So to me, the striking thing though is that the model that she's advocating for in the early 50s, that idea of what is the way that basically large-scale architecture is already being produced in Mexico, which is a kind of private, public partnership with the role of the state being very significant. She's already kind of foreshadowing or prefiguring that in her shows. And she initially, it's true, that show in many ways is not, as a provocation, in its very specific moment, doesn't seem to really do that much. But it's very remarkable how gradually in the decade after that point, a number of different figures and institutions and producers of design adopt precisely that model. And to me, that model actually becomes, by the years of those exhibitions I was showing you, that becomes pretty much the predominant way in which industrial design is understood, a particular kind of industrial design. And it bears not only the formal imprint of what Porcet is advocating, what she's actually designing. It's formally grounded in what she's saying, but it's also the same logic of production that is being implemented. And it's a funny story of why that's not really attributed to her or others like her from that moment. And I think it has a lot more to do with the historiography of that moment than with the moment itself. So there's many more things that are remarkable about that show and her gestures from that moment. But I really do think that there's a gradual way, and this is not fully understood yet, but there's a very interesting way in which that becomes the predominant mode for production. Her mode, or what she's saying when no one else is saying it, really, in that sense.
I think that what Porcet is kind of remarkable is that she started really very early on when she was in Cuba for this new idea, of the new model. What all the articles she wrote for Social were kind of more general on decoration, were kind of like stressing the need of this new model and the use of the local materials and to design for the local conditions and for the very specific weather conditions of the Caribbean. And she translated that into Mexico when she did all her professional practice. And really, she influenced it like all over the region. And other designers, for example, in Venezuela, were kind of aligned with that vision, like Cornelis Sidman in his little writings on his furniture company, stressed the necessity of emphasize the local materials and the local type of furniture like in modern version. And I found it very interesting that now we have this strong emphasis on the butake. And I'm very happy because I've been researching the butake since colonial times. I've been publishing a lot of things on the type, on the development of that type of furniture. And I'm surprised why now there is so much interest in that type of furniture that in Mexico had a relatively new diffusion. It was only in the coast, and it's only in the 20th century, thanks to Porcet, that entered into kind of mainstream culture. And I would like to comment on that, the presence in the domestic landscape of the mid-century Mexican.
You can really see that particular chair first as a kind of strange entity and gradually becoming a natural part of the modern domestic environment. And the arc of that entrance probably spans the early 50s. By the late 60s, it's already fully just naturalized in a particular kind of environment. And it is not just the domestic environment. The tourist environment is really significant, which is why the scenography of that hotel I was showing, particularly Camino Real Hotel, and which is, of course, part of a chain of hotels, now an even bigger chain, but already is born as a chain, already has picked up a particular idea of the modern Mexican design interior that includes that type of chair very significantly. And it's kind of at the center of a lot of scenographies of that type. And the particulars of the introduction are very funny because Porcet is already talking about that kind of stuff as early as the 40s, like early 40s really. And it isn't until about 25 years later or so that it becomes naturalized. It has a lot to do with, for example, its introduction, I guess, among modern architects has a lot to do with Barragan's first uses of the chair, which are usually attributed to him, but it's really Porcet. So there's a number of different channels through which that particular type is introduced. But the funniest thing is that when it is introduced, the kind of its reinvention is such that the chair is positioned as if it is a kind of timeless pan-Mexican type of chair. When the actual history of the chair is very culturally specific to kind of a small part of Mexico, and it isn't just a Mexican chair. It is a kind of pan-American
Caribbean chair.
Caribbean chair.
For the whole Caribbean.
So yeah, and that goes along the lines of the kind of reinvention of that folkloric paradigm of the middle of the 20th century, which is, of course, predates the middle of the 20th century. There's a longer history of the atavistic glorification of folklore, which is earlier in Mexico. But the butake is part of the reintroduction, retooling of that paradigm of the middle of the 20th century.
And another very interesting thing for me is, and probably Patricia have kind of better idea of this, is the role of architects as designers, which is they are kind of the official, entitled to be the official designers, and kind of somehow neglecting the professional designers that were acting on the, like Porcet, that they try to kind of hide over the years her role as a promoter of design. So how do you see this connection of architects being like promoted as?
I think one of the important projects that kind of surrounds this is the creation of, as it was stated, the creation of an industrial design school, right? In order to give it some sort of professional stamp, or professional cohesion, right? That became sort of an important aspect, certainly in the 60s in Argentina at this moment. But we still have, for example, the interiors of the banks that were produced by the firm of Manteola, Solsona, etc. I mean, they still, it's interesting that one thing that you start seeing in Argentina at this moment is a complete divorce of the objects from these spaces that they're supposed to inhabit. They really they try to disarticulate this notion of a stage sort of event that is very particular, I guess, to the way Porcet was kind of staging in the 50s. You see it already still in the 50s in Argentina, but when we start arriving to this period of the 60s to this project, they completely detach it, and it becomes just the object of pure design, as if then, there's a sort of a need then to have a professional that is able to understand, right, the forces of design themselves. And this is actually one of the statements that Maldonado makes. When Maldonado starts, he goes to Argentina in the 60s, late 60s, right at this moment when this is actually brewing, and he actually states that, you know, that in Latin America or in design overall, they needed to sever the link between art and design, and that design had to become almost like in the trenches, that you had to fight the battle of design in industry itself, inside industry, and not in art and in pure form. He completely severs this notion that he already had developed, right, with Max Bills, etc., you know, with this kind of, you know, the total conception of space that is completely, then you see it present in the magazines, you know, has this, the object itself and the universality of the object is the prime imprint of industrial design.
It's a very fraught relationship in a number of different contexts because there is, well, more than one thing's going on. There is, in general, mid-20th century architectural culture across the board, there is on the one hand, a rise in a specification and a separation and the growing independence of the domain called industrial design. But there's a reciprocal phenomenon whereby that field is having a lot of influence over the reinvention of architecture as a field in and of itself. So a lot of architects who, before that point, is very interesting, don't call themselves designers, don't self-define as designers, begin to adopt the term designers as a more holistic term than what architect means. So in what that operation usually leads to in the historiographic response is an elision and an erasure of what was actually a much more clearly segmented chain of command in the actual projects. And you can see it in the career of Ramiz Vasquez is a great example. He worked alongside many different designers. But the corporate authorship of everything that his office, which is a very large office, produced is usually attached to him. And he was among the first in Mexico of architects of his generation to call himself a designer, which encompassed architecture plus everything else, including environments, including specific objects, including exhibitions, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a number of different other relationships that you could talk about that are very similar, where there is a co-optation of the term design and designer, the notion of what designer is, which is a kind of retooling of the kind of fountainhead idea of the architect that has a very specific mid-20th century connotation. And it involves the kind of cannibalization of industrial design and its kind of forced inclusion within the redefinition of what architecture is. And that happens at the same time as other people, like Patricia was saying, are attempting to divorce the two disciplines. So there's claims of autonomy and separation on both sides, but I think the historiographic pressure is such that the architect has, the figure of the architect has won in terms of our memory of the events. But I think there's many surprises when you actually look very closely and situationally at these projects, where you see that it's a very kind of fluid and very fraught boundary in all of these situations. Exhibitions are really significant in that sense. How exhibitions have historically attributed authorship. How, in the case of Barragán, this may be the most obvious example, there's a similar cooptation around the persona of the architect, which also encompasses the idea that he was also a designer, which I don't think he himself would have even claimed when he was around. And I think exhibitions, exhibitionary culture has a lot to do with the creation of this particular memory around those events. So there's a number of different ways, but I think we all know of a number of different situations where, depending on the situation, the variables change of why someone gets credited and someone doesn't. Often there's a gender divide that's very obvious in a lot of cases. There is and we're also forgetting that there's other people involved in the design equation that are not just architects and designers. There's this very strange role of the craftsperson who is neither of those things, but who actually is called upon as the kind of unsung hero of the equation. Right? But the name of the actual craftspeople often, not always, but often don't appear as part of the memory of the events. So there's a class relationship, there's a gender relationship, a number of other factors.
I would like to open to questions.
Well,
Please, Wendy.
but how is this different from the long-standing tradition ever since the arts and crafts movement, which whole thing is art is unity of, you know, fine art, architecture, sculpture, decorative art, you know, all the equal playing field, and all the great arts and crafts people, C.R. Ashby, Boise, Bailey Scott, all collaborated with industry, all did lines, including wallpapers, to, you know, Breuer, Mies, I don't, because you're presenting this as something that happened there, but how is this different from just being part of that continuum?
Yeah, it's obviously part of it, and this is a.
But what's distinct, though?
Yeah.
If you're talking about
I
a
would
distinct.
I would say that one of the distinctions of this period, at least in the conversation, is the impending sense that industrialization has to happen now. That this is the moment. If we don't do it now, it's never going to happen. And this kind of like guillotine, like hanging over the heads of designers and architects, in Latin America, I think it's a constant and it's a reality that it's actually one reality that we could say brings Latin America, makes the term Latin America real. So this sense of we have this project, if you don't do it now, it's never going to come back.